Good evening. I am Dino Dave, and I'm glad to be back with you folks for this, our session of our creation investigation. Last time we visited, we began with asking the question, how do we know there's a God? We talked about answering atheists. And this session, we're going to try to get a little bit more specific as we approach the origins debate. We're going to ask the question, should the evidence for creation be taught in the public schools? Give a little bit of the history. And we'll come to find out, how did our school systems become ground zero in the origins debate? Now I'm looking at a very intelligent group of people here, and I'm going to ask you to kind of go back in your memory just a little bit for me and play along if you would. How many of you had high school biology? Some of you guys can actually remember that. Okay, a lot of you guys had high school biology. Now here's the key question. Did you dissect anything? Oh, almost everybody dissected something. That's really good. You actually got to see the blood veins and the tissues and trace some of these things out and see some of the different organs. What did you dissect? Frogs. Overwhelming. Huh? A cat. Okay, they had some money in your school system to actually bring in a mammal, a cat. A fetal pig. Okay, this guy gets the trump card. He gets the gold star tonight. He has the fetal pig. But it seems like the frogs once again won it overall. Well, I'll have a quick frog story as we start off here. So there was this frog sitting in his little pond, minding his own business, doing his froggy thing, waiting for a bug to come by. And all of a sudden, what should appear right before his eyes but a fairy godmother? And of course, the frog knew what was going to happen next. Here he was. He's a frog. There's a fairy godmother right in front of him. He just knows it's his lucky day. And along is going to come a beautiful young princess and pick him up and lay a big old smoocher on his lips, and he's going to turn into a prince. You guys all know the fairy tale, a prince, right? Well, the fairy godmother said, I will tell you this. You are going to meet a lovely young lady, and she's going to want to know all about you. Well, the frog wasn't content to leave it there. He said, well, when am I going to meet her? And the fairy godmother said, in her second semester biology class. So sometimes you're better off not knowing the rest of the story. But tonight we're going to carry on and tell the rest of the story. We'll go into a little bit of history here. As every single session, we're going to start as our jumping off spot with the Word of God. And you feel free to turn in your copy of Scriptures if you wish. But I have these verses on the overhead. You can follow along there as well. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 20, our starting point for tonight. The Apostle Paul says this, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science, falsely so called. Oppositions of science, falsely so called. This is the Greek word gnosis, where we get the word knowledge from. And it's this idea that there are things that go under the guise of sure knowledge that aren't. They're somebody's wild speculation, perhaps they're metaphysical guesses, and they go under the guise of actually knowledge, translated in our authorized versions as science. Science. We could call it pseudoscience. And it becomes important for us in our sophisticated, modern, we might say even postmodern world, to be good at discriminating between science, real knowledge, and pseudoscience, folks, wild speculations. And increasingly, there's a confusion between observable, demonstrable science, that is science like chemistry and physics. We can go into the laboratories, we can test it, it can be replicated in other laboratories. Biology, like we do when we're going to dissect a frog, and we can see certain things and trace things out, and it's going to be the same, it's going to be replicatable. But we have to discriminate between that and the historical sciences that we can't observe and can't be repeated. And it doesn't mean that it's completely lacking in scientific rigor, because folks might approach things with a little bit of a scientific tool set, but it's not at the same level of observability and susceptibility to the scientific method as the hard sciences that we can observe and repeat. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit as we go into this. Here's our outline we're going to cover through the course of our session. I want to talk about the history of the controversy. We're going to talk about the limitations of science. and then very quickly we'll end with the two model approach. So let's talk about a little bit of history. I'll move quickly through this, but we're going to begin with a biblical basis. Sometimes folks say, Dino Dave, I just think you're down on science. I actually love science. I grew up as a kid just loving everything science. I had to make a hard choice when I went to college, but chose physics and then went on and got a master's degree in biology. I love reading science articles. I love scientific facts and I love all the latest technologies, and I just enjoy this type of thing. And in fact, I'd take it a step further and say, I believe God commanded to do science. God commanded to do science. My quarrel is not with science. My quarrel is with pseudoscience that's passing off as science. Now, Genesis chapter 1, verse 28 is where I would take you to this command. And God says to them, to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And here it is, subdue it and have dominion over every living thing that moves upon the earth. What does that word mean, to have dominion? Does that mean that we go around and we just trash the environment on earth in such a way that it negatively impacts future generations to come? Is that what it's talking about? Well, I'm going to have dominion. I'm just going to step on everything. I'm just going to squash everything I can, and whatever we can shoot to extinction, that's awesome. No, that's not what it's talking about. This is a picture of bringing things carefully under control. Think about if I had a corral out back and there was a wild stallion in that corral. It had never been ridden, it had never been broken. And I'm looking for a volunteer that's going to go out and ride this horse. I'm not so sure I'd get any volunteers for that. But there are people, I wouldn't want to do it, but there are people that know just how to do that. They know how to approach this amazing animal, and they know how to calm this animal. They know how to get the rope up and around, and you've probably seen this on television. They're balancing with their hand and they're swinging, and eventually they kind of take that horse to the point of breaking it, where that horse's strength can be brought under control. To bring things into dominion. What does that take to do that? It takes knowledge to be able to subdue and have dominion. It takes careful study and preparation so you don't hurt yourself and the creature in the process. That's the idea of science. Knowledge of the natural world that lets us bring things into order and be able to put things into a useful place like that wild stallion. And so we see very quickly that there is tremendous early scientific advances. This is really remarkable. Just a few generations down from Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 4, we read, and Ada bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents and of such as have cattle. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of such as handle the harp and the organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. Now think about this. These folks aren't a bunch of bozos that are just kind of trying to figure out maybe the basics of subsistence living. Maybe working with some real primitive tools. No. A few generations down from Adam and Eve, they're smelting ores and producing wonderful musical instruments. Specialization. The hallmark of civilization. They're tremendously intelligent. Probably a lot more intelligent than we are today. Obviously, they don't have all the scientific background that we stand upon from multiple generations, but tremendous intelligence to very quickly move forward with agriculture, music, and the smelting of ores. Well, we're going to move quickly through a lot of science. We could talk about, Egypt and Babylon and the Greeks and all this stuff, but we're going to move quickly to the modern scientific enterprise, which really began in medieval Europe in the Middle Ages. And I'm going to make a statement here and then try to back it up. The great classical scientists were creationists. The great classical scientists were creationists, and most of them Christians. There's some deists in there maybe and some other things, but by and large, Christians, and they were creationists. We're talking about people like Ray Linnaeus in biology and Galileo in astronomy and Lord Kelvin in physics and Georges Cuvier in geology and Robert Boyle in chemistry. These are the fathers of these various scientific disciplines that we read about in our textbooks. Why is this important? Evolutionists will say things like this. Well, if we allow creation a foot in the door in the science classroom, we're going to set science back. We're going to set science back to the point where people are believing in pink fairies and the god Thor making lightning. We can't do that. That belief in the supernatural and superstition like that, that's terrible. And they act as if atheists established science, and we can't let the Christians come in and pervert it. The exact opposite is the case. Science was begun by Christians, by and large, and certainly by creationists. You see, it was a creationist worldview, the belief in an orderly creator that allowed for scientific enterprises to flourish and the scientific method to come into being. Let me give you some quotes from a few of these folks. Here's Michael Faraday, and he says this: "Where the word of God has sounded, there his people are drawn together to the obedience to all things that Christ has commanded." Does he sound like an atheist to you? Not quite. Here's Johannes Kepler, famous for his pursuit of physics, early father in the world of physics. I love this quote: "The chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God, which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. Science is thinking God's thoughts after him." Science is thinking God's thoughts after him. Amazing. I'm not sure he could teach in a public school classroom today. They might run him out of town. Here's Sir Isaac Newton. And, of course, we have Newtonian physics. We have the calculus and so much tremendous advances. These were brilliant, brilliant fathers of various science, in some cases ladies, but mostly men. And he said, "This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent being." Notice he capitalizes being. "This being governs all things, not as the soul of the world, but as the Lord over all. The supreme God is a being eternal, infinite, absolutely perfect." Here's Nicholas Copernicus. And Copernicus, of course, is the one that we credit with coming up with this idea that the earth really goes around the sun, the Copernican model, rather than the earth being the center of our solar system. And Copernicus was motivated to comprehend the mechanism of the universe wrought for us by a supremely good and orderly creator, the system the best and most orderly artist of all, framed for our sake. Let me give you one more. Here's William Paley. Now, William Paley may not be quite as familiar a name to you, but he really was extremely popular at the time of Charles Darwin. He was presenting this idea of intelligent design, that we should be able to, just from looking at the natural world around about us, come to the understanding that there was an intelligent being that designed it. Natural Theology was the name of his book, and he was famous for this watchmaker story, this watchmaker inference. And the idea of a discovery of a watch upon the sand carries a message of design. If you're just walking along the beach, we're seeing rocks, we're seeing some driftwood, but then all of a sudden, even if we're unfamiliar with this object, we pick up a pocket watch and we look at it and we see the sophistication and the orderliness and the apparent purposefulness of this thing. And he says the inference we think is inevitable, watch must have had a maker. So this ability to recognize design from just the random forces of nature, and the watchmaker argument is credited to William Paley. Now, this is, of course, the early 1800s, and as you begin to march forward in the 1800s, there's a bit of a sea change in Europe. It becomes a time of turmoil, change, in some case rebellion against the powers that be. You have the anarchy of the French Revolution. We introduce Freudian psychology, the start of communism. And into this kind of swirling world of philosophical change come the Darwins. And I say the Darwins plural because this was really a family heritage. Charlie didn't kind of pop out of an egg into a vacuum. Rather, Erasmus Darwin, his grandpapa, had already written a book on evolution called Zoonomia. And so Charles was a product of his time. He was more of a catalyst even than an innovator. And so one of the key people that influenced Charles Darwin was Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell. You ever wonder, where do we get this idea of the Earth is millions and millions of years old from? James Hutton a little bit, but also Charles Lyell. And here's Lyell. Lyell was trained as a lawyer, but he was also a naturalist, and he wrote a book called Principles of Geology, which is a very, very famous book. And he said his stated goal was to free the science from Moses. To free the science from Moses. What does that mean? Does anyone want to take a stab at it? Well, think of what Moses wrote. What did Moses write? The first 5 books of the Bible, right? Do they impact on something that maybe might be argued about in science? Creation, right? And then also something else. Starts with an F. The flood, right? So these, if you hold to the Bible, you're going to come away with a couple of key things. You're going to come away with a creation account that's very, very clearly given. You're going to come away with a flood account that's very clearly given. And Lyell has problems with both of these. He wants them out of science. He doesn't want to think in terms of a catastrophe like a flood forming the great rock formations. Remember, he's writing Principles of Geology, so he's looking at these rock formations. He wants to think more in terms of slow and gradual processes. We think of the word uniformitarianism, when we think of Lyell. Well, Charles Darwin, here he's a young man in 1831, and he gets aboard at age 22 the HMS Beagle. He's a naturalist. He's going to go out and explore the world. He takes 2 books with him. He takes his Bible because he has a theology degree, and so he takes his Bible with him. But he also takes Charles Lyell's book with him. And I'm not sure he cracked his Bible, but the book by Charles Lyell would literally change his life. And Darwin would begin to think not so much in terms of millions of years of gradual rock formation, but he would think in terms of biology. How might millions and millions of years of slow and gradual change affect species? And maybe their ability to morph from one species into another. And that's really where this idea of natural selection would come to be. Now, others had posited ideas of evolution. For example, Lamarck is famous for his evolution by acquired traits. You might have studied this, and you might remember the giraffe. And of course, Lamarck tried to explain how this giraffe had this long neck. And so he said, well, it probably started off with a short neck, like a horse. But then he ate all the leaves at a certain level and to kind of reach his neck up a little higher. And then eventually all those leaves got eaten to reach his neck even. And so generation by generation, this trait of this long neck gets passed down and then exaggerated, and eventually you end up with this ridiculously long neck, and you end up with a giraffe. And of course, it's just a speculation, it's a story. There's a problem with the story. It never really caught hold because there's a pretty significant problem with it. Question, if I lose an arm in battle, in war perhaps, or some accident, do my children get born with just one arm? No. Okay? So changes like stretching of one's neck, for example, a blacksmith might, through the course of his life, take that hammer and slam in the anvil. One arm might be slightly longer than the other. That's pretty typical. But do his children get born with a slightly longer arm? No, to affect that next generation, you have to have changes to the genetic code. It has to be in the sperm and the egg. Of course, they didn't know about all at the time, but these things don't get passed on to the next generation. So evolution by acquired traits was an attempt to explain some of these things, and it was a failed attempt. But then Darwin came along with evolution by natural selection. And for those of you where it's been a while, we'll just do a quick review. But Darwin noticed that there's overproduction. That is, a lot of different species, populations produce more offspring than are just required to replace the parents. And there's various ones I could cite, but I show some rabbits here, for example. And we grew rabbits growing up, and oh my goodness, we begged my dad, like, no more rabbits. We got tired. We had rabbits fricasseed and rabbits cooked and broiled and rabbit pie. I mean, every way you could eat rabbits. We're so sick of rabbits, I'd never want to touch another rabbit. So finally, my dad agreed, and we got the blue rabbits all over here and the pink rabbits all over there. And then one of the blue rabbits became pregnant. We're like, can't get rid of these rabbits. But no, rabbits just can produce like crazy. But then you notice a little bit of diversity amongst the offspring, some light-colored ones, some dark-colored ones, just as an example. Maybe you got also short hair, long hair, this type of thing. And so you have variation. So overproduction and then variation. And then natural selection. That is, perhaps in some environments, like, for example, the Arctic, the light-colored ones will survive better because the predators won't see them as well. By the way, it's better to be light-colored predator, too. So you have white bears and you have, white birds and all kinds of white creatures there in the Arctic. And so natural selection. And then those genes tend to get passed along, and so you have a whole population of white creatures, maybe in the Arctic. And so you have survival of the fittest type of the genome. So this is pretty mild as it goes. I mean, as creationists, we wouldn't even have much of a quarrel with this type of thinking, right? At the end of the day, it's still rabbits. But then folks began to take this and run wild with it and say, whoa, we can explain how all the animals came from a common ancestor. In fact, even you and the asparagus that you had for dinner have a common ancestor. And so this is where the basic thoughts presented in Darwin's book kind of got exaggerated and tried to explain the origin of everything with evolution. So Darwin was a catalyst. He was a symbol more than an originator. And a lot of folks then took his ideas and really ran with them. A couple of people I want to specifically mention. One is Thomas Huxley, called Darwin's Bulldog. And he'd go to a town and he was spoiling for a fight. And he wanted to do debates. And he was just an ardent spokesperson for Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. But then also the Reverend Charles Kingsley, who helped give credibility to evolution because he was a man of the cloth. And there weren't a lot of atheists in those days. And so for him to come out and say, well, you know, I think evolution is just great. I think it fits fine with my thinking as a minister. And so he helped spread the gospel of evolution. And we're going to talk about both of these guys, key guys, Thomas Huxley and the Reverend Charles Kingsley, a little bit more as we go. But if we fast forward in time, this little plant that got started with Charles Darwin, Origin of the Species, has grown up now over the course of these years, and evolution, of course, is taught in history classes and chemistry classes and, of course, biology classes and all different things. And we see the fruits. Matthew 7:20, Jesus said, "Wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them." We can see some of the fruits of evolutionary teaching. Things like communism, racism, humanism, eugenics, relativism, and atheism. Now, I have on numerous various times gone into the public schools and presented this slide, and when I look at the audience, I can see I'm losing people. So I want to be very careful to back up my assertions here. Here's what happens. People say, well, wait a minute. You can't blame Uncle Charlie for all these things like racism? I'm sure there was racism before Charles Darwin came along, and if he hadn't come along, there would still be racism. And that's true. But the massive amounts of racism of the late 1800s, along with the 20th and 21st century, can be traced to a large degree to evolutionary thinking. And I want to back up that statement along with these other things that I've put up here. So I want to give you quotes directly from some of the founders of the evolutionary theory. Here's Charles Darwin, and I'm quoting from his book, Descent of Man, on page 588. See how you ladies like this quote. "The chief distinction in the intellectual power of the two sexes is shown by man's attaining to a higher eminence. The average of mental power in a man must be above that of a woman." Would we say that Darwin is a wee bit sexist? Oh, yeah. Here is Sir Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin. He founded the evolutionary science of eugenics, this idea of breeding people like you would breed animals to get the best traits passed down to subsequent generations and remove some of the undesirable traits. 4 of Darwin's sons became leaders in the movement of eugenics: ethnic cleansing, the use of abortion to eliminate defective babies, euthanasia, and harvesting of baby body parts for research, all come from the survival of the fittest eugenics theory. Here's the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger. She was a eugenicist and a racist. She believed that they needed to stop the reckless breeding of feeble-minded. And she said, quote, "the greatest biological menace to the future of civilization." This is the founder of Planned Parenthood. It's no accident that Planned Parenthood put their clinics in minority communities. It's not politically correct to talk about some of this stuff, but this is the hard facts of science. Here's Thomas Huxley, Darwin's Bulldog. Look at this disgusting quote. "No rational man, cognizant of the facts, believes the average Negro is equal, still less the superior of the white man." I hope you find that very repugnant. It got pretty quiet in this room. These are things that evolutionists will like to sweep under the carpet because it's inconvenient facts of the history of the movement of evolution. Here's Ernst Haeckel, the leading voice for Charles Darwin's theories in Germany. He says, quote, "I consider Negro to be a lower species of man, cannot make up my mind to look upon him as a man and a brother, for the gorilla would then also have to be admitted into the family." Disgusting, gross, obnoxious racism. Haeckel published a book, and in 1874, he had this drawing. You see this in German, but you see the chimpanzee and the gorilla and the orangutan, and here he has the Neger, the black Africans there on that same tree. Charles Kingsley, we talked about him. He's the reverend that blessed Darwinism. He said this, quote, "The black people of Australia, exactly the same race as the African Negro, cannot take in the gospel. Poor brutes in human shape, they must perish off the face of the earth like brute beasts." How can a man that believes in the Bible say anything like this? The only answer is he doesn't believe in the Bible. He's passing off as a minister, but it's just disgusting. And you might say, well, it's Victorian England, and the British thought they were better than everybody, and this was pretty common in those days. No, it wasn't. It was led by some of these evolutionary luminaries. In fact, Stephen Jay Gould, he's an evolutionist, passed away now, but for many years was one of the leading evolutionists in the world, taught at Harvard University. And Dr. Gould said this, quote, "Biological arguments for racism increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory by scientists in most nations. Evolution gave intellectual credibility to the racists and literally poured, gasoline on the flames. And racism shot forward. By the turn of the century, Darwinism had provided a new rationale for American racism. Essentially, primitive peoples, it was argued, could not be assimilated into the complex white civilization, for they believed the Negro race in America was in the throes of a degenerative evolutionary process. Some are going to come along and say, but Dino Dave, haven't a lot of terrible things been done in the name of Christianity as well? Like, what about the Crusades? And the answer, of course, is yes. But here's the difference. You can't go back and find anything in the teachings of Jesus Christ or the apostles that justify the Crusades. That's the perversion of Christ's teaching, somebody using it as just a cover for their own greed and lust for power and violence. But I'm taking you back to the actual statements of the founding fathers of evolutionary theory, Charles Darwin and Huxley and Kingsley and Haeckel. 1904, they had the World's Fair. It's held in St. Louis. And a special display was set up. And there was a cage, and they had this chimpanzee in there. And along with it, they caught this poor fella. He's a pygmy, and they put him in the cage alongside the chimpanzee as if he was an animal. Oda Benga. Oda Benga, after the fair, was taken up and displayed at the Bronx Zoo, and eventually he committed suicide. Terrible story, tragedy. The racism is more subtle today, but you can open a lot of books on evolution and see something like this. Do you notice the change in the skin color? Why is that? Vestigial racism. There it is. But can I remind you that at the same time when Kingsley was saying, these Africans have no soul, they cannot even be saved, they cannot believe the gospel, they're just like animals. During that same time, missionary David Livingstone is going to Africa to try to end the slave trade and try to win people to Jesus Christ. You have the abolitionist William Wilberforce arguing forcefully for the abolition of slavery. Christians led the charge against slavery and against racism. Malachi 2:10 says this, "Have we not one Father, hath not one God created us? Why do we deal treacherously every man against his brother by profaning the covenant of our fathers?" Racism was fanned and fueled by evolutionary thinking. How about communism? Here's Karl Marx, founder of communism. He said, Karl Marx enthusiastically embraced the writings of Charles Darwin, calling it the basis in natural history for our view. How about Nazism? Here's Adolf Hitler, quote, "The German Führer has consistently sought to make the practices of Germany conform to the theory of evolution. Book Mein Kampf, My Struggle, is full of racist and evolutionary ideas." Here he writes on page 216, no more than nature desires the mating of weaker with stronger individuals, even less does she desire the blending of higher with lower races. And of course, he believed the Aryan race was the highest race. Influential German geneticist and Darwin apologist Dr. Ludwig Plate wrote, progress in evolution goes forward over millions of dead bodies of inferior humans. The key elements of the worldview have been constructed and repeatedly reaffirmed by linguists, racial anthropologists, evolutionary scientists, and geneticists. And the results, my friend, of this thinking is a matter of history. Now, historically, Western society has derived its belief in the dignity of man from the Judeo-Christian belief that man is the glory of God, made in his image. According to this view, human rights depend upon the Creator who made man with dignity, not upon the state. If we believe the state in its benevolence has allowed us to have these human rights, then what can the state do? It can also take them away, right? But if these are inalienable rights that God has given us, then no state has the right to abrogate those rights. You see the difference? This is very important. It's not a trivial matter. Well, let's move on to some other communists. Here's Joseph Stalin. At a very early age, while still a pupil at the ecclesiastical school, Comrade Stalin developed a critical mind and revolutionary sentiments. He began to read Darwin and became an atheist. Stalin is said to have killed 60 to 100 million of his own people. Here's Mao Zedong in China. When the communists took over China in 1949, they began killing Christians by the thousands. Mao murdered over 45 million people. Mao listed Darwin and Huxley as his two favorite authors. Is this just a coincidence? I don't think so. Charles Darwin himself wrote in a letter, he said this to W. Graham, looking at the world at no distant date, what an endless number of lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world. Endless number of lower races. Well, we talked a little bit about some of the history from the medieval times, the Renaissance, the starting of the scientific enterprise, and really in the United States, creation became a bit of a cornerstone in our education system. That didn't change until into the 20th century. There was an event that changed it. Does anybody know what was the event that really popularized teaching of evolution in this country? It was a court case. Who remembers the name of it? Scopes trial, right? Here we have the Scopes trial, 1925. It's called the Scopes monkey trial by some people. Popularized evolutionary teaching. Here's the Dayton, Tennessee courthouse where they had the trial. And it was all kind of orchestrated and arranged like, okay, now you teach evolution, then we'll sue you and we'll bring in Clarence Darrow, this famous lawyer, and we'll bring in William Jennings Bryan. It's going to be great for our town. We'll have lots of publicity. It's going to be this huge circus. But it actually, even though the creationists prevailed at the trial, it actually popularized the teaching of evolution. And so really there was a sea change at that point, and by the 1960s, evolution was commonplace in biology, chemistry, world history, and geology. Now, by the 1980s, some of the southern states, kind of think Bible Belt states, were being troubled by this advance of evolution into the classroom. And so Louisiana and Arkansas in particular passed what's called the equal treatment laws. And they said, listen, if you're going to teach evolution for an hour, okay, you have to teach creation for an hour. Equal treatment. I mean, a lot of these parents that are paying for the public school with their tax dollars, they believe creation. And after all, it's their students. Shouldn't they? There's their children that are the students. So shouldn't they have some say in their children's education? So it certainly seems pretty reasonable to me. And so there's these equal treatment laws. Well, there was a court case, and Edwards versus Aguillard, and this went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so you had the ACLU and the People for the American Way and the teachers' unions. They all kind of jumped in on this thing, and it went all the way up. And the Supreme Court ruled, well, you cannot mandate to teachers what they should teach. And so these equal treatment laws were thrown out. They were overruled. And that has kind of been the lay of the land politically and legally. So that teachers today are afraid to present the evidence for creation, oftentimes because of threats from the ACLU and others. Now, Adolf Hitler said this, "Let me control the textbooks and I will control the state." Do you think he's right? He was evil, but he was brilliant, and he was dead on correct. Okay, we've talked about some of the history of the controversy. I want to switch gears to our second point here, limitations of science. And so I'm looking for a little participation at this point. I want to ask the question, what is science? What is science? And please, if somebody could help me out here so we at least have some participation, make sure everybody's awake. Somebody put it in your own words, what is science? Yes. A methodical approach. So science is more than just a body of facts. Science is an approach. It's inquiry. It's a way that we gather knowledge. And so what I'm going to say is this. Science is knowledge obtained by the scientific method. Knowledge. We agree it's knowledge. We can teach it, and there's this body of knowledge, but it's more than just knowledge. It involves the inquiry. It involves the process. It sometimes involves the tools that we use but to do observation and things. But this scientific method is important. There's various knowledge, right? We got the knowledge mathematics, 1 + 1 = 2. It's knowledge, but it's not science. You spell tree, T-R-E-E. It's knowledge, but it's not science. So science is knowledge obtained by the scientific method. Now, what's the scientific method? Hopefully you remember some of this from school, but observation, we observe some phenomenon, and we're like, okay, let's kind of study this out, try to figure out what's happening. Maybe we make some intelligent guesses and hypothesize a little bit. And then we do some experiments, and we try to explain things, and you might come up with some theories, general explanations, and some laws, regular principles, and some facts, some well-confirmed assertions. And this kind of becomes our body of knowledge that we call science. Now, there's some limitations to the scientific method. Some limitations. And for example, science often can describe but not ultimately explain. For example, is light a wave or a particle? Somebody said yes. It's both, right? Depending on how you look at the photon, right? And so we can't really ultimately explain what it is. We can't ultimately explain gravity. So these are some really fundamental things that we can use. We can make predictions. We understand them to a certain degree, but we always fall short of this ultimate explanation. And then science is susceptible to constant revision because of human fallibility. Has science changed in the last 100 years? Oh my goodness, yes. It's changed in the last decade, right? Significant ways. In fact, the changes even seem to be escalating and becoming more, going at a faster rate, greater velocity. And so sometimes we make mistakes in observation. Sometimes we have natural prejudice. Just because we put on a white lab coat doesn't mean that we leave our prejudices at the door. And scientists are like everybody else. They have egos, and they have personal opinions, and they have vendettas, and sometimes there are better scientists and worse scientists. And but there's human fallibility, and so science is always being tested and rechecked and revisited, and we should always be welcome for that. And then science is not able to answer moral questions. Science can invent an atom bomb, but it can't tell you whether or not to drop it. To figure that out, we got to dig deeper into the toolbox for tools like philosophy and even morality, things that science can't address. And then science is based on philosophy and faith at its core. I have some folks that object to this. They say, no, you're a man of faith because you believe in creation. I'm a man of science because I believe in evolution. Science cannot validate the scientific method. You can't test the scientific method to see if it's the right way to do science. You can't even define science by the scientific method. We have to start off with philosophy. And there's some undergirding assumptions that are based on faith, like the laws of science hold into the past and they will hold into the future. They hold everywhere around the earth and they hold going out into the universe. These are things that, we take as assumptions. One of them is that the world is real, that it's knowable, that we're not just brains in some laboratory being fed stimuli. We can't disprove that, but we have to say, okay, the world is real and it's knowable. So there's limitations to science, and the key objective of science has to be workability, not absolute truth. If you're looking for science to give you absolute truth to base your life upon, you will be disappointed. Science is gathering things from the outside natural world. It's trying to figure out what's going on, what's happened. It's bringing that world under dominion. That's the proper role for science. And when we elevate it to something that's supposed to enlighten us about morality, and we look to the scientists as some kind of a priestly class, then all of a sudden we've gone awry. We're asking science to do something that it's not capable to do. So let's ask another question, and this is where things start to get a little bit interesting. Is creation religion? How many say yes? How many say no? Okay, a few say no, a few say yes. Well, let's start with defining our terms. When I do debates with evolutionists, it's really important for me to define terms like creation. I'm going to define it this way: abrupt appearance by design. Various groups that might espouse creation, you might be a Catholic or a Muslim or Jew, and you might have different ideas about God, but abrupt appearance by design. Now, there are philosophical assumptions that go along with this. So to that extent, it certainly seems to be somewhat religious. But can I suggest to you that you can teach about a fine-tuned universe, which we talked about a little bit yesterday. We could teach about the failure of spontaneous generation. We'll talk about that in our next session, that life comes from non-life. We could talk about abrupt appearance of certain fossils and gaps in the fossil record. And we have not established any religion. We don't even discuss religion. We're merely talking about the evidences for design. Now let's flip the coin the other way for just a minute and let's ask this question: is evolution science? Is evolution science? How many say yes, evolution is science? Okay, we've got a few. How many say no, it's not? The no, it's not kind of won out on this particular presentation here. Well, again, let's define terms. It becomes pretty difficult to get any two evolutionists to agree on a definition of evolution. And oftentimes they want to water it down to just, well, it's a change in a gene pool in a population. But that doesn't explain origins. To really explain origins and to be a substitute for creation, you have got to have molecules to man transformation. Otherwise, it doesn't work in the origins debate. So that is the way it has to be defined when we talk about evolution versus creation and an origins debate, because it has to be able to explain origins. Otherwise, you still need a creator. So this is not testable by the scientific method. Origins can't be observed. They cannot be repeated. Can you take me to your laboratory and show me a Big Bang? Can you take me to the field somewhere and show me life coming from non-life? Nobody's observed these things. We can make guesses about the past, but this is not susceptible to the scientific method. And then much of evolutionary theory is metaphysical. That is, it's more inclined to be philosophical or even pseudoscience as opposed to actual, hard, observable science. Even this key idea of survival of the fittest, there's no way of defining fitness except to watch what survives. That is the definition of fitness. So there's always going to be the fittest that survive. That's the definition. It's a tautology. A guy by the name of Sir Karl Popper, I'm quite fond of him, he came out with a way of defining what is science. And he said, it must be vulnerable to falsification. That doesn't mean it is false. It means there must be some way of testing it. If you can't test it, if you can't go back and say, well, let's make some predictions, let's put a test to it, or let's see if we can observe this, it's not science. It's somebody's wild speculation. It's perhaps somebody hypothesizing and just making up stories, but it's not science. Here is a gentleman by the name of Michael Ruse. Why is Michael Ruse important? Michael Ruse was the philosopher of science that won the day with the Supreme Court, Edwards versus Aguillard, and convinced the justices that we should not allow the states to mandate equal treatment laws, teaching creation and evolution equal amounts of time in the classroom. He said, no, we can't have that because that violates this idea of separation of church and state. And the Supreme Court went along with it. Well, guess what? As the arch witness in favor of the evolutionists, a few years back, Michael Ruse did a 180. And he got a lot of hate mail. But he said this, quote, "In particular, I argue that both evolution and creation have rival religious responses to a crisis of faith. Rival stories of origins, rival judgments about the meaning of human life, and rival sets of moral dictates, and above all, what theologians call rival eschatologies, pictures of the future and of what lies ahead for humankind." Michael Ruse came out and said evolution is basically a secular religion. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but I would definitely say a lot of evolutionary theory is storytelling, it's hypothesizing, it's metaphysical, it's scientism. Now, what about this idea of separation of church and state? You might be surprised to know that there is no such phrase in the U.S. Constitution. That phrase was used by Thomas Jefferson in a letter to a Baptist pastor in Danbury, Connecticut, not too far from where we are here this evening. He wrote it in 1802. The idea originated with the Baptists of Rhode Island, and their whole point was to keep the government out of the church. They'd seen the challenges of a state-run church in Massachusetts, in the colony of Massachusetts, and they didn't want that to be the case in Rhode Island. They wanted to have this idea of a separation of church and state. And later on, this general concept got enshrined in the Constitution, in the First Amendment. Quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Now, did they mean by this to outlaw the teaching of creation in the public schools? No. These folks taught creation in the public schools in those days. These are some of the same crowd that would write in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." Okay, we talked about the history of the controversy. We talked about the limitations of science. Let me wrap things up here fairly quickly with this two-model approach. There are two prominent models, creation model and the evolution model. Both are philosophical in nature. They are not hard science. We might at best say they're historical science. They're not susceptible to the scientific method. So the best approach, it seems, would be to present both models. Let students scientifically evaluate them for reasonableness. You say, well, Dino Dave, what would you like to see taught? Well, just to put it in some real simple terms, I'm going to suggest, under the creation model, origin by design. Over against that, on the evolutionary model, natural origin. Number two, decreasing order. That is, if things were designed by an intelligent being, then they would be designed at a certain level. We read in Genesis account, for example, that God said it was good. At best, it's held level. At worst, it's degenerated. The laws of thermodynamics. Over against that, you have to have, on the evolutionary side, increasing order. Now, it might not be a constant straight line increasing. It might be having its ups and downs and whatnot, but you have to get from molecules to man over some period of time. Increasing order. And then on the creation side, catastrophism. That is, that the great geological formations were formed quickly by a catastrophic process. Over against this idea of uniformitarian gradualism, that is, the great formations were formed by processes a lot like what we're seeing every day today, but over long periods of time. So there are three basic tenets on the creation side, three basic tenets on the evolution side, and we can put some pretty interesting facts under both of those. So we're going to see this slide again. From here on in, I'm going to talk about some of these key tenets on both sides. Now, here is a quote by Cornell evolutionist William Provine. He's a leading evolutionist, and I like his idea. He says, "I have a suggestion for evolutionists. Include the discussion of supernatural origins in your classes. The exclusionism you promote is painfully self-serving and smacks of elitism. Why are you afraid of confronting the supernatural creationism believed by the majority of persons in the USA and perhaps worldwide? Shouldn't students be encouraged to express their beliefs about origins in a class discussing origins by evolution?" I completely agree with Dr. Provine. Why not discuss both? Why not have both models presented so children can be educated? Are the Darwinists afraid of a little competition? Are they afraid their fairy tale won't stand up to some competition. They say, well, Dino Dave, that's not very nice of you to call it a fairy tale. I choose my words very carefully. Remember in the beginning, I told a little story about a frog sitting on a lily pad. And along comes a fairy godmother. And then you have the princess. And the princess is about to do something to the frog. What's the magic ingredient? She's got to kiss the frog, right? And she lays this big smacker on him, and poof, he becomes a prince. See, the magic ingredient is the kiss. Of course, that's a fairy tale. We say that's silly to believe that a kiss could do that, right? Frog plus kiss equals prince. That's a fairy tale for children. Can I suggest that we have a similar fairy tale for grown-ups? The only difference is the magic ingredient. That is, the frog plus time equals a prince. And magically, this transformation happens if we can put millions of years in there. Here is a typical school biology textbook illustration. There's the frog, there's the prince, and you just have to have millions of years. Here is a quote from The Guardian, 2022. Underneath all this lurks another deeper question, whether the idea of a grand story of biology is a fairy tale we need to finally give up. Here's Henry G. He was chief editor of Science, and he writes this: to take a line of fossils and claim they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story. Amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. Did you know that pretty consistently, every poll, 86% of Americans believe creation should be taught alongside evolution? Even lawyers, bless their heart, by a 2-to-1 margin believe it's constitutional. So why can't we teach both? Here's Stephen Jay Gould, again, Harvard evolutionist. He says, no statute exists in any state to bar the instruction in creation science. It could be taught before, and it could be taught now. Even in the case, Edwards versus Aguillard, back in 1987, the Supreme Court, as part of the decision, said this: teaching a variety of scientific theories about the origins of mankind to school children might be done with the clear secular intent of enhancing the effectiveness of science instruction. They're saying if a teacher wants to teach certain facts, they're welcome to do it. You just can't mandate it. You can't mandate equal time as a state. Okay, let me conclude. Here's my conclusion. Public schools should not be the forum for religious presentations, secular humanism included. However, there are two legitimate models of origin that can be presented without establishing a religion. Besides, we should not teach error simply because the truth might have moral implications. All the scientific evidence supporting both creation and evolution should be presented so students can reach their own conclusions. True science and true learning demand nothing less. So I do believe it would be in students' best interest to teach both models. Now, some atheists are going to come along and say, whoa, 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 there's some implications to that might have some moral connotations. Okay, when you teach evolution, it has some moral connotations too. Remember the racism, the communism, the eugenics? So what can we do? Can I suggest that it might be a small thing, but you could donate a good book on creation to your public school library? I have a copy of my book, Chronicles of Dinosauria, up there. Talks about dinosaurs. It's got some wonderful pictures in it. It's kind of draws in young people, and it has a wonderful gospel plan of salvation. You could donate this. There's other good books I could suggest to you. I've donated some of Strobel's books, Case for Creator, to different school libraries. But just to be involved, just to get out there, run for school board, get involved. Reach into your community. Try to make a difference. Jesus said this in Matthew 5:13. You're the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its savor, its taste, wherewith shall it be salted? It's thenceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and to be trodden under the foot of men. You're the salt of the earth. Jesus wants us to be salty. Now, I read a verse like that, and you have to pardon me, but I can't help but think a little bit scientifically. Salt is an amazing substance. The first thing that comes to mind is salt adds flavor, right? Hey, are we making a difference? Are we making an ungodly world a little more palatable to a creator who has a taste for holiness? Are we being salty in the world around about us? Salt also has a preservative effect. That is, if we went fishing and we caught a couple fish and we tossed them in the backyard and we came back 2 weeks later and it's like, hey, you know what? I think we should eat some of that fish. What do you think, Kevin? Should we go out and eat some of that fish 2 weeks later? Maybe not a good idea, right? Been sitting out in the sun for a couple of weeks. But if you took those same fish and you packed them in salt and put them in a barrel, you could put them on a ship and take them out to sea and you could eat them for months because of the preservative capabilities of salt. Are we helping to preserve? Are we helping to stop and inhibit the decay of our culture, of our society around about us by being salt? And then I think of salt having some medicinal value. I'm not going to suggest it's the leading antiseptic, but if you got a cut and you didn't have anything better, you could pack some salt on it and it would help kill the germs. It would probably sting a little bit too, but it does have some antiseptic properties. Are we making a difference to people that are hurting? Are we making a difference to people that have had tragedies in their life? Are we coming alongside and being salt? Are we salty Christians?